get started, what I'd like to do is ask you a little trivia question. This is not the question to win the prize. So one of the things I like to do when I give a talk, whether it's here or at Joe Catholic or whatever, is give away books, okay? Resources for people to learn more about the faith. So today's giveaway is the Compendium of the Catechism of the Catholic Church. This is kind of the Reader's Digest version of the big green catechism book. So that's what we're going to draw for at the end of the talk, all right? So, and the thing I like about it is, for those of you that remember the Baltimore Catechism, how many remember the Baltimore Catechism?
Oh, yeah.
Remember how it was done in question and answer format? This follows that same format. So it's a good, easy tool to learn some of the basic fundamentals of our Catholic faith. So here's my question. Who is the only signer of the Declaration of Independence who was Catholic?
Charles Carrollton.
Charles what?
Carroll.
Yeah, Charles Carroll. And where did he live?
Land of Mary.
Yes, he did. He lived in the land of Mary. He lived in Maryland. He came from the town of Carrollton. Okay? And there's still a town in Maryland called Carrollton. You can actually take the M train from Washington, D.C. out to Carrollton. It's one of the stops on the Orange Line. And so I just thought that's kind of fitting, since now I did a little bit of research. They say that our city is not named after that Carrollton, but I'd like to kind of believe it on some level. Maybe it is. So anyway, so John Carrollton and Charles Carrollton. His cousin, John Carrollton, was the first bishop of a Catholic diocese in the United States. So there's your Catholic trivia for the day. That's related to
Not Carrollton.
Yeah, Carroll. Sorry. Thank you.
The first Catholic diocese was in Baltimore.
Yeah. All right, so one of the things I want to say up front to just get this out of the way is that this is not a political talk, okay? Because in the end of the day, we should not define ourselves based on our political affiliation. So we're not Republicans, we're not Tea Party members, we're not Democrats, we're not liberals, we're not conservatives, we're not progressive Catholics or traditional Catholics. We're simply Catholics, following the teachings of the church. Okay, and as I said on Saturday to the guys at Joe Catholic, we follow the teachings of the church. Why? Because the church teaches what Christ taught, and that's what makes it true. Okay, and so when we encounter people, rather than say, well, the church teaches this, we can substitute Christ for church and say, Christ taught this. All right? So, what I thought I would do is I'm actually going to talk about this in the framework of 3 primary documents that I've written on the board. The top one is called Gaudium et Spes, which is the pastoral constitution of Church of the modern world. It was one of the Vatican II documents. The second one is called Lumen Gentium. Okay, and I don't remember what that is in English. I think it's Light of the Nations. Light of the Nations, that's what it is. And then the last one is an encyclical written by John Paul II called Veritatis Splendor, which is the splendor of truth. Okay, where he addresses these issues of morality and forming our consciences. Ultimately, that's what the primary part of this talk is going to be about. So I thought what I would start off with is talking about what your mission is. Okay? And one of my personal missions that has been weighing heavily on my heart for like the last 6 months, that anytime I talk, to get it through to the people that I talk to, that you are the church. Okay? You are the church. Not this building over here called St. Catherine, not the Fort Worth Diocese, not the Vatican. You are the church. Okay? And as I've said before, and I'll say it again, when you see a need, fill the need. Okay? We're the ones that are called to action. We're the ones that Christ said, go out and spread my good news. Because we, the laity, those of us who are not ordained or not religious, we make up the majority of the church. We're supposed to be the doers. Does that make sense? So, what are we called to do? Well, one of the primary things that Vatican II did was give us our marching orders. There's this wonderful document called the Decree on the Apostolate of the Laity. An apostolate is just a fancy word for action, okay? Doing, okay? And this is what it said. It said that the laity, everyday normal people, are supposed to use their gifts to explain, defend, and properly apply Christian principles to the problems of our era in accordance with the mind of the church. To put it in simpler terms, that means that we are called to change the culture around us. We are called to infuse the culture with Christian ideals. That's what we're called to do. That's our function. To influence the temporal order and to bring that environment into conformity with those Christian ideals. And we do that by being fortified, listen to that word, fortified, strengthened through the sacraments. They give us the power, they give us the strength to make the church present in our everyday, ordinary lives. Okay? And so that's part of what it means to be a citizen, right? To be out there in action and influencing the culture around you, whether it be politics or just your smaller community, that also is supposed to be influenced with your Catholicity. Now, what does the culture tell you? The culture says to us, keep your religion out of politics. Isn't that what they say? Isn't that what we see it in the news all the time? Okay? Which is a bold-faced lie, and it's a cheat on two different levels. Number one, all law is based on what? Morality. All law is based on morality. Now, what is morality? Anybody? What is morality?
The will to do right.
Say again?
The will to do right.
All right, the will to do right, that's part of it. Anybody else want to add something to it?
Natural law and divine law.
Okay, that's part of it too. The natural law kind of helps infuse morality. But ultimately, whether we take out the Catholic part of it, what is a system of morality? When it really comes down to it, morality is the system that somebody used to determine what's right and what's wrong. And so in the end of the day, it doesn't matter if it's our Christian ideals or some secular atheist ideals, somebody's morality is affecting the law that's being implemented. Yes or no?
Yes.
Absolutely it is. And the other lie that they're telling you is that our Constitution says, keep our religion out of it. That's not what the Constitution says. Go look at the First Amendment. It talks about the Establishment Clause. It's to protect us from the government, not the government from us. Does that make sense? So we need to be armed from both ends because we're letting that culture dictate the dialogue when we sit back and sit on the sidelines and be quiet. And the bottom line, if you don't get anything out of this talk, is that we are called to be in it. We are not called to be sitting on the sidelines or in some prayer closet hidden away. We're called to be in the thick of things. Now, some of us may be called in different ways. Some of us may be more outspoken in what we do. Some of us may simply, by the way we live our everyday lives and the way we encounter other people, may be affecting the change in the culture. But every single one of us is called to action. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Before I do, I want to just give you a little glimpse of what the culture, the secular culture, is spewing out there. Now, we're all probably familiar with Cardinal Ratzinger before he became Pope Benedict. On the eve of his election, he talked about the dictatorship of relativism. which I like to call the notion of it's all good. Because if it's all good, nothing's wrong. It's that whole notion, well, if it's good for you, then that's all right. It's all right, dude. Whatever works for you is all right. And what works for me works for me. And at the core of that notion is that there's no such thing as real good and real evil. And they're really trying to eliminate the notion of evil and sin. Right? But one of the most outrageous statements ever made on this subject was done by the Supreme Court. Okay? By Justice Kennedy in a case called Planned Parenthood versus Casey. And this is what he wrote. And by the way, this is still good law. At the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life. See, it's that sort of thinking that has gotten us where we are now, where those of you that are on Facebook, you know, on Facebook now you have 56 different options of what your gender is. That's where that sort of thinking leads you. That you can think yourself into thinking that there are more than two genders. So, we know what the call of action is. And one of the things that we learn about being Catholics is that rights come with duties. All right? So if we have a duty to action, there's some rights that are associated with that. So the church never calls us to do something without arming us. In fact, that's the responsibility of the structural church, the institutional church. The priests and the bishops are the ones that are supposed to be instructing us. Okay? And then from there we go out. And one of the best tools that the church has given us is this. Okay? And if you don't have this in your library right next to your Catholic Bible, you need to get one. Okay? This is the Catechism of the Catholic Church. The church has only ever put out 2 universal catechisms. The first was the Catechism of Trent. This was the second one. Done in 1994. Was it 94? Yeah, 94. Great gift by St. John Paul II. So you need to have the green one. And the reason I recommend the green one is because it has a cross-reference in the back. So, the first thing we need to do is we need to be well-formed. Okay? Because what this really comes down to is that we hear people say, well, let your conscience be your guide. That's a false statement. The real teaching is let your formed conscience be your guide. To put it another way, have your informed conscience be your guide. To know what is right and what is wrong. To know what the church teaches us. Now, one of the things I'm going to say up front is this. There is no Catholic checklist of what does the church teach about blank. Okay? You're not going to find that. That'll never happen. What the church wants us to do is to be informed about moral truths and make decisions based on those moral truths so that we can live it out properly in our lives. They're not going to set out every single example. So a couple of things that we need to do. We need to learn our faith. This document, Gaudium et Spes, that I mentioned, said that we have a responsibility to form our consciences in accord not only with Catholic teaching, but with sound human reason. That's one of the other things, is that the church has always taught that faith and reason go hand in hand. We don't put our brains outside the door when we enter the church. Because the church believes and teaches, rightfully so, that if you use the brain that God gave you properly, you're going to find the truth. We're not afraid of that. The church is not afraid of that. So to put it simply, if you want to, some of you are probably familiar with this phrase, if you want to boil down what the church teaches how we should make moral decisions, is to do good and avoid evil. Do good and avoid evil. That's pretty simple stuff. You know who said that? One of the greatest minds ever in the church, St. Thomas Aquinas. Do good and avoid evil. All right, so how do you form your conscience? The first is you've got to want to have your conscience formed. For some of us, that may be a roadblock. I know if I would have sat down and talked to you 20 years ago, there were some things about the church I did not want to accept as true. I remember reading a book. It wasn't the Catechism, but it was a book about the Catechism. And there were chapters of that book I would not read because I did not want to feel convicted. I didn't know it at the time, but I was convicted whether I read it or not, because the truth is the truth, right? But the first step is we have to accept where we are. Do we know what we know? Do we know what we don't know? Do we know that we have to learn more? Because in the end, what this is all about is sharing the gospel, right? You can't share what you don't know. So we talked a little bit about this on Saturday. And I know this is the talk about being a good citizen. But all of this... well, let me back up for just a second. How many of you in the last month have been asked some type of question at work or in some social environment, a question about being Catholic or some issue going on in the world around you today that has to do with morality? How many of you have been asked any type of question like that? Then the rest of you, no? No questions at all? So maybe I'll make you feel a little uncomfortable. My next question is, do people around you know that you're Catholic? Okay, now I don't mean go around and beating people over the head with the catechism. I mean, do they know by the way you live your life that there's something different about you?
Yep.
Because sooner or later, if people notice that about you, they're going to start asking questions. Sometimes it may start off with them picking a fight, but really, they're hungry for the truth. And as 1 Peter chapter 3:15 says, you have to be prepared to defend the faith. To put it another way, you got to know what you're talking about. Are you ready? Are you ready right now? So one of the things that we need to do in order to be good citizens, if you're going to be, first off, it starts off with be a good Catholic. Learn more about your faith so that that can infuse the decisions that you make in the public sector. Does that make sense? Now, the simplest thing that we can do as citizens is and it's probably one of the most important rights, and we don't talk about it enough, and that's what?
Voting.
Voting. And so the first thing that we have to do is vote with our consciences. Now, I know that every time the presidential election comes around and the gubernatorial election, there are great debates about whether or not we can put out what do they call them? The voting guides. Okay? We have to be real careful about whether or not the voting guides, because we can't use political parties. We have to just talk about issues, right? Anybody had any experience with that? Okay? I know we've had experience with that. I know the Knights have had experience with that here, and whether or not you can or cannot distribute certain materials, because people are worried about their IRS nonprofit status. Okay? But if you're properly formed in moral teaching, do you need that checklist? No. So you should be one of those voting guides for your family and friends. That's what I'm saying. So the first thing is that we got to want to know the truth. Then we got to study it. Okay? And I already talked about a good place where it gets started is learning from the catechism. Get plugged in. And believe it or not, one of the other things is you got to have a prayer life. You have to have a daily prayer life. That means every day at a set time having a conversation with God. Do you have that? And as part of that, reading Scripture. Now, if it's not, you can start tomorrow morning, okay, or tonight, all right? And the thing that I recommend is I think the easy way to get started is the daily readings. I figure, if the church says this is the order that the readings from the Bible are going to be, if it's good enough for the church, it's good enough for me. That's a good start. And you just follow that for 3 years, you cover most of the Bible. All right. And if we do all of this, then we develop some virtues. And one in particular is the virtue of prudence. And prudence is just a fancy word for putting right reason into action. That we know things intuitively. Like phrases, we've heard this phrase before, that the end does not justify the means. And that we live our lives that way. I saw I don't remember if it was Google Plus or Facebook, some social media, where a Catholic buddy had an ATM machine that had given him too much money. And he thought the right thing to do with that extra money was to give it to a charitable organization. That was not his money to give to a charitable organization. Right? That's a real life example of the ends don't justify the means. Even if we're talking about $20. All right, so a couple of principles that I want to leave you with, and then hopefully with some resources. And this, for those of you, I know I had a couple of people asking about what was taught at Joe Catholic on Saturday. This was the gist of Joe Catholic's talk on Saturday, and that was that all social doctrine of the church is founded on 5 principles. The first is this notion of common good. The way I like to put this is that we're all in this together. And the common good doesn't mean the greatest good for the greatest number. That's a utilitarian concept. Okay? And if you start thinking about that, the greatest good for the greatest number, that starts turning in on itself. When people get too old and aren't able to give worth to society, what do? We put them down like a dog. That's what that mindset leads to. Or when a child is inconvenient to our current lifestyle. That's what a utilitarian mindset leads us to. Common good means that it's the good for everyone. Second, human dignity is rooted in the idea, the notion, the reality that we are all made in the image and likeness of God. Even that person who you cannot stand is made in the image and likeness of God. And they're to be treated with the dignity that is due a child of God. Maybe first it starts by seeing yourself in that person, or better yet, thinking of them as another Christ, because they are. The other concept is called solidarity. Okay, you may have heard this term from the 1990s. This is what led eventually to the downfall of communism. I like to think of this as the 3 Musketeer principle. One for all and all for one. Okay? It means that we are our brother's keeper. It means that we are responsible for taking care of each other. And that fits very nicely with what the Knights do, doesn't it? Okay? But that's something we should all be doing. And we see little glimpses of that, and that's good. Okay? If you take a look at some of the early chapters of Acts, that's what solidarity was. There wasn't a need for hospitals or public institutions because the people were doing it. You can't talk about solidarity without talking about subsidiarity. Okay, and that's a phrase that that's a word we don't hear in the everyday vernacular. It's a fancy word for what I call Catholic federalism. Okay, it means that we take care of things at the lowest level. Okay, to help people get back on their feet. You know, the example that I gave the other day is that when we were in Rome on the pilgrimage a few years ago, we had the privilege, a few of us, to have 2 consecutive nights of talking to Bishop Van. And one of our former Grand Knights, Greg Young, was asking Bishop Van a number of questions. And a lot of these questions had to do with why doesn't the diocese do this? And Bishop Van's answer was, that's really not my job. That's Father Matthew's job. And what Bishop Van meant by that, he wasn't being flippant. He was demonstrating this concept, this principle of subsidiarity. That Father Matthew has a better handle on what the needs of St. Catherine are than Bishop Van or now Bishop Olson, right? And the example I used on Saturday, Lyndon and I have a better idea of the needs of Joe Catholic than does Father Matthew or the staff. And so that we can take that to the smallest level possible. And sometimes that may mean the neighbor if somebody's in need. But the other side of this is that we have to remember that this concept of subsidiarity is that our job when we help people is to not treat them like objects. And that happens a lot of time in the nonprofit world. Our job is to get them back on their feet so that they can take care of themselves. That's a huge difference from what the secular world does. In a lot of ways, the secular world wants them to be dependent. And that's just as bad. That's dehumanizing. The Catholic way is very human because we're going to find a way to help them with their short-term need and then help them with the long-term need of being able to take care of themselves. Because the final principle is called participation. We're all called to participate. Even the person who's poor or whatever state they are in life is called to participate with their own gifts and talents. And so when we look at issues, we need to think of those things in mind. We need to think about the common good. And the thing that drives all of it is human dignity. When you stop and think about all the issues that are floating around out there right now in our country, almost all of them have to do with the lack of respect for human dignity. They do. So I'm going to leave you with a quote from one of my favorite saints. Saint Josemaria said in The Way, have you ever heard or have you ever thought of how absurd it is to leave someone's Catholicism outside of entering a university or a professional association or a scholarly meeting or a Congress as if you were checking your hat at the door? In other words, take your Catholicism out into the world. And you don't have to hit people over the head with a Bible or a catechism. Let it form the way you make your decisions. And be an agent of change, to borrow their phrase. And we're not called to sit on the sidelines. Because when we sit on the sidelines, that gives evil an opportunity to win. Because we're all familiar with the phrase that all that evil needs to prevail is for good men and women to do nothing.